In this tutorial, you'll learn how to build a beautiful navbar with HTML and CSS and specifically Flexbox, including hover effects, and it is also completely responsive. You will also learn some modern design tricks. You can find the final code of this project at the GitHub link in the description, so if you get stuck, you can go to the final code and compare that with your own code. Let's get started.
Alright, so I've set up a simple project here. I just have an empty HTML file and I also have a logo SVG. So I have opened this up in the browser. It's currently empty and this is what we're going to try to create, right? So let's start with the HTML for this. So here in my HTML file, what you can do in Visual Studio Code is you can write HTML, pick the second option, press tab, and you get this HTML boilerplate. I will change the title here into Navbar tutorial. And we're going to link to a CSS file, right? So I can write link, press tab, and it will ask me for the path. Well, let's just say it's going to be a style.css file in the same folder, right? So let's create that file. I'm going to call it style.css. And here's where we're going to write our CSS in a second. Let's continue here with our HTML. And actually, before we do that, we are going to use a different font than the default font. So let's also do that, right? Because you can see the font here. It looks pretty cool. I think it's called the Inter font. So we can go to Google Fonts and find it over there. So let's see, I'm not sure why this is the link here that we get, but it should be fonts.google.com. And the one that we want is called Inter. It's a very popular font. It's quite similar to Roboto actually, but I think it looks a little bit better. So we'll pick the light one and let me see, regular, medium, semi-bold and bold as well. So then here in Google Fonts, sometimes you have to click on this icon, I find. But once you click on that and you have this sidebar, here they show you how to include that. So we can just copy this and let's go back to our HTML and then just paste it here. I'm going to hold Shift-Alt-F to format everything and then it puts the cursor there again. But this is now properly formatted. So what you get is basically two pre-connect links. This is just for optimization, and then the actual link, which is actually the Inter font, which is actually what we need. So now we can close this and let me make it a little bit more like this. Okay, so now let's continue with the HTML for this navbar or header, because there is actually a header tag in HTML, which is the appropriate tag to use here. I'm going to give it a class of header as well, and then press tab. And then in here, we're going to have an inner div. So I'll show you why that's necessary. But if I make this full screen, for example, you can see that the width of this navbar essentially is constrained, right? So it's not sitting against the edge here. The content is not sitting against the edge. The header in total does have that background color from end to end, but the content in there is, constrained. So to do that properly, the best way to do that is we're going to set a background color on this header, which will stretch all the way. But then for the content, we're going to have another element here. I'm going to use a BEM notation. So for class names and so on, you're going to see a lot of underscores and dash dash. This is a very clean way of naming your classes. I have a whole course on CSS, and part of being a professional front-end developer is knowing about how to name your classes. So BEM is one system, and it's part of the course as well. So then this is the content that's going to be constrained, right? So then in here, we're going to have all the content. So we're going to have the logo. Now, typically, on a website, people want to be able to click the logo. So typically, it's going to be an anchor tag. I'm going to give it a class of logo. It's not going anywhere. And then in there, we're going to have the actual logo. It's actually an image in my case. There's logo.svg. So I'm going to use image. And then it's just logo.svg for me. And alt, just logo. Okay, so that's the logo. And then on the right side, we have the actual links, right? So here we can actually use the nav tag. And I'll also give it a class of simply nav, right? So the nav tag is appropriate for important blocks of navigation, right? So this is an important block of navigation. So here we would use the nav. And then in there, typically how this is structured is as follows. So you would have a list, right? So we can call that nav list. And then in a list, you have list items. So you have nav item, and then in there you have the actual link, right? So it's quite nested here, but it's not going anywhere. So now we have solutions, right? And then I'm going to select these lines. I'm going to hold Shift Alt down arrow key to duplicate it. And to select these lines, by the way, you can go with your cursor on here, hold Shift, and then I can go up with my arrow key until these three lines are selected. And then I can hold Shift Alt down arrow key, and which will duplicate those lines, right? So it's going to be solutions, projects, and contact. Right, and you can add more links. It will work the same way. You know, maybe you need to do some different styling, especially when it gets to responsiveness, but it's going to be approximately the same way. Now the last link here, this contact, should actually be a button, right? So this is not going to be a nav link like the other ones. This will actually have a different class of btn. Okay, so this is all the HTML that we need. If we save this file and go back to our project here, if I refresh, it's going to be one big mess. We don't even see the logo here in my case because it's white text and we have white background here. So now we get to the CSS. Make sure you've properly linked to the CSS file. So then in the CSS, the first thing I like to do is actually a reset, because the browser adds some default styling, for example, to these anchor tags and to these lists. You get this blue color, and for lists, you get these bullet points. And it adds a lot of other styling as well, like padding and margin to a lot of elements. So typically, you know, people have this simple reset. They remove all margin from all elements, right? This is the universal selector. We're selecting all elements on the page. We set all margin to 0 and also all padding to 0. And then there's actually a very difficult one called box sizing border box. This helps a lot when you set the height or width of an element, because if you set the height or width, let's say the width should be 100 pixels. Well, what does the 100 pixels include padding, for example? Right, so that's actually very complex. This is the most difficult property in CSS. I have a separate video on that. I definitely recommend you check that out if you want to know more about how that works. But this is a very typical, simple CSS reset. And actually, I like to add some comments sometimes to my CSS just to add a little bit of structure. So this would be reset, and then we're gonna have some base styles, right? So here you could say base styles. For example, here we're gonna select the body, and we're gonna set, for example, background color here, right? Because right now it's just plain white background color. Now a popular design trend is to give it a bit of a bluish gray color. So in this case, it's gonna be E8F, 0F7. If we save here and refresh, you can see it has now become a bit of a grayish, or, you know, with a bit of a blue tint. This is a very popular design trend. Instead of having pure grays, right? If it was a pure gray, it would sit all the way here, right? But if you only use pure grays, it can look a little bit plain sometimes. So the design trick these days is that people put in a little bit of blue into their grays. That gives a bit of a cooler look. And I also don't want to keep refreshing whenever I make a change. So I'm going to use Live Server here. It's an extension. Maybe you have already installed it, but you can find this extension here in Visual Studio Code, Live Server. I have already installed it. It's by Ritwik Day, 30 million downloads almost. And then what you can do is you can right click on the HTML file and click on Open with Live Server. So then whenever you make a change in your HTML and CSS, it will automatically refresh the page. So I don't have to keep refreshing myself. Now, by the way, these links are still blue with an underline, right? And there are other issues, but we'll solve that in a second with other parts of the reset. So some other base styles here is we want to set the font. You do that with font family. We have already linked to the font here in the HTML, but we still need to set it in the CSS as well. So the font family here is going to be Inter. And if Inter is not available for whatever reason, you can provide another font here after the comma, so like a backup. So we say sans serif here, which means pick any sans serif font that is available on the user's computer, right? Because maybe the server is down, right? googleapis.com, maybe it's not working, and so Inter is not available. So then the browser will pick the backup font that you specify after that. And also, because we're gonna make the nav fixed, right? So we want a scroll bar here, right? Now we're not going to have enough content to have a scroll bar, so we're simply going to set a very large height here on the body so that we have, you know, some scrolling to do. So let's just say 5,000 pixels or something, something like that, right? So then we can also scroll down and we can actually make it fixed. All right, now before we continue with the header style, let's also reset these styles for the anchor tags. And we actually don't see it, but the list also has those bullet points. We just don't see it because it's sitting against the edge here. So what we can do is we can select all anchor tags on the page, and we can just remove the underline with text decoration none. And the color, instead of setting it to, for example, black, it should be whatever is like the dominant color for the text on the page. So it should simply inherit it from whatever the color should be for text on the page, right? So you can just set it to inherit, right? Because we could set a color here on the body and it would be inherited by all the text elements in the body. We don't do that here, but the default is black. So this is what we have now. And also we want to remove the bullet points. We don't see it here, but they're still here. So we can select all UL elements and we can say list style should be none. Okay, so now let's actually continue with the navbar, right? Or the header, right? Because we're using the header tag here. So let's see, after the base styles, we're gonna have all the actual normal styles, right? So here we can select the header. And let's remember how we structured this in the HTML. So we have the header, and then in there we have the header content, right? Because the header will stretch all the way from side to side. So let's actually give the header itself that background color. So we can say background color is going to be RGB 19, 22, 26. So let's see what we get if we do that. So this is what we have now. And when we do that, we don't see the text. So let's actually select these nav links and give them some lighter color so we can actually see their text. So let's see, we have nav link. Now what we want to do with these colors is initially they're not completely white. They're actually a little bit, they're white with a lower opacity. So then when we hover them, they become completely white. Let me actually zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing here. So when we hover them, they actually become opacity 1, but initially they're a little bit lower opacity. So what we can do here is say color RGBA and should be white, right? So 255, but then 75% opacity. So let's see what we get. Okay, so then we see this. Now we also have that button, and the button has a different class, right? So we have a BTN class here, and this one should actually be white initially, completely white, right? So this is what we have right now. Now we want them to sit horizontally like this on the same line, right? So we're going to deal with a layout here. So with layouts in CSS, it's really important that you have mastered Flexbox and ideally also CSS Grid. Most of the time you want to use Flexbox, so it's really important that you have mastered Flexbox. Now Flexbox is also part of my CSS course, so if you want to be a front-end developer or you're already a front-end developer, definitely check out my CSS course if you want to take it to a professional level. So let's actually just select all of these elements because we have different selectors here and it's easier if we just select them already right now. So we have header content as well. And this is the element that we're going to use to create the layout in a second. So then we also have logo, and then this image here, we forgot to do it here, but this needs a class as well of image, right? So make sure you have logo and then also logo image for classes, right? So then we can have logo and logo image, right? Make sure you've added logo image as well. Let's see, then we have the nav, right? And we have a list in the nav. And then in the list, you have items, right? This is always quite nested. Let's see. So we have link, right? Links. I think we have everything. Let's see. BTN. Yeah. So now we have all the selectors that we need. And this is what we have so far, right? So now we want to work on the layout here. So what we want is that they're sitting on the same line. And for that, we're going to use Flexbox. So with Flexbox, it's always about a parent element and its child element. So we want the logo and the nav to sit next to each other horizontally. And their parent element is this header content element. So this is going to be the flex container, meaning this is the one that's going to get display flex. And when you do that, you already get some default behavior, which is now that the logo and the nav element are indeed sitting horizontally next to each other, but they're not vertically aligned the way that we want. So what you can also do with Flexbox is, if in this case, we can use align items for vertical alignment. And we're going to say those flex items, the nav and the logo, should sit in the center, right? So now you get that nice alignment. Now we also want these links, right? These items rather in this list, they should also sit on the same line, right? They should sit horizontally next to each other, not a vertical like this. So here, these nav items are child elements of the nav list. So what you can simply do is you can make this a flex container, meaning you're going to say display flex on this and then unlock the Flexbox functionalities. But you also get the default layout, which is that they're going to sit next to each other horizontally, right? So you can sort of nest Flexboxes like that. It sounds very complicated, but it works as expected, right? So the nav and the header content are flex items of the header, or rather the logo and the nav are flex items of header content. But then nav list is also a flex container, and these nav items are flex items in this nav list container, right? So it's sort of nested, but that looks and sounds very complicated, but it works as expected. There's no complications there. It just works. Let's see what else. There should be space between them, right? So these links, these nav should sit all the way here, and the logo should stay here, right? So what you can do is, let's see. So we want the nav to sit on the right side and the logo on the left side, right? So this header content, we can do that with Flexbox. We can just say that's horizontal alignment. So we use align items for vertical, but we can also say justify content. And for example, we could say center, right? We could say, well, they should sit in the center here, right? That's how you can align them horizontally. Let me actually make this a little bit smaller. Let's see, right? So we can say justify content center. We can also say end, and then they're all gonna sit at the end, right? The default is actually start. So that's how they're sitting now. Now we can also say space between, right? And then there's going to be as much space between them as possible. So this is what we have right now. Now the header right now is not very tall, right? So it should be a bit taller than this. So we can just say, we can just set a min height on this header content, right? We can say the minimum height of this header content should be, for example, 60 pixels. Right, so then it's a little bit taller. And now it gets interesting because you can see it's sitting against the edge now. Right, so the nav here is sitting against the edge and the logo is sitting against the edge as well. Now in the real world, what you want is usually it's going to be constrained a little bit because people's, your users are not going to be very comfortable if your content is stretched horizontally completely. Usually you want to center it a little bit. And also for responsiveness, what you don't want is when you make the viewport smaller, eventually, it gets very close again, but you don't want this to sit right against the edge. So here, as we make it smaller, you can see that the width here gets smaller as well. So it's never sitting against the edge here. So there is some padding here, right? So that it nicely becomes less and less wide, but it's very nice and responsive. So that's why we've done it with this structure here in the HTML, because now the header is spanning the entire width, right? So it has that background color. But now what we can do is on this header content, we can restrain the width. So we can say the maximum width of this content should be 1200 pixels, right? So now this header content is 1200 pixels. So it's actually just going to be this part. And then here we have more of the header. But now we want to center that header content in the header horizontally, right? So what you can do, one trick is if you have set a max width in CSS, you can also use margin auto. So 0 on top and bottom and auto on left and right side. This has nothing to do with Flexbox. This is just, a standalone trick. And then what you have done is the following, right? So they're sitting more restrained, but also centered, right? That's what we want. Now we will work on the styling here because there's going to be more space here. So it's going to look slightly different here in a second. One other thing we want to do is we want to change the logo image a little bit. Let's see, logo image. So here it's a bit big actually. So what you can do in images, let me actually make it smaller so you can see the difference. You can just set a height or width and it will make it a bit smaller. And also images, they are inline level elements by default. So they have some space, some weird space below them. So I'm going to make them a block level element so that they're gonna remove, so that weird white space below them is removed, right? So now it looks a little bit better. Now what we don't want, like I just showed you, is when the viewport gets smaller, that they're sitting against the edge of the viewport, right? That's not what we want. So we also want to add some padding here to the header content. So we can say padding 0 on top and bottom and 30 pixels on right and left side. And when you do that, you're going to get a very nice responsive layout already actually, because it's never going to sit right against the edge. It's just going to be smaller and smaller with that nice little space between the content and the side of the viewport, right? But never taller than 1200 pixels, right? So now you've got a nice responsive layout already actually. Right, not complete, of course, but this is actually already an important part of making a navbar responsive. All right, let's continue styling these links. So let's see how we structure this. So this is the nav, and then this is the nav list, right? So let's add some space between them, between these items. So we can do that with Flexbox. So the parent element of them is the nav list. So we already use display flex here, and what you can do is simply use column gap for vertical space. Let's say 40 pixels. So when we do that, it adds the space between them, right? And then let's continue styling them. Let's say if we hover them, we want to get a cool hover effect, right? So let's see that we're going to use CSS transitions here. So let's see nav link. At the moment they have 75% opacity. Let's actually also reduce their font size a little bit to 15 pixels. And what we then want to do is when we hover this link, so we can say nav link hover, we actually want to get this color, the white color, but then 1% or sorry, 100% opacity, right? So now when we hover them, they're going to be white. Now this is instant and we want this to be smooth. So what you can do on the normal rule set, so not in the hover state, but on the normal rule set, we can say for every property that gets changed, right? Not just the color, but maybe we have other properties as well. So we can say all properties that get changed it shouldn't happen instantly. It should happen in 0.4 seconds, right? So now this is very smooth, right? So CSS transitions and animations are very important in CSS. It's also part of my CSS course, right? Now this button right now has some different styling because it has the BTN class, right? So we'll make it a button in a second. Now what we also want is when you click on this link, that it keeps that style, right? So in other words, this is the focus state. So when we focus, when we click on it, this element becomes focused. So what you can do is you can use a comma to add additional selectors here. So not only do we want to do this color for a hover state, but also in the focus state, right? So then when you click on this and it becomes focused, it keeps that style. Okay, and what about this blue underline? Well, this is actually, usually you want to do this with a so-called pseudo element. You could do this underline with, for example, a text decoration underline, but you cannot really animate that. And you can also do it with a border on the bottom, but a border on the bottom may actually add some height, and therefore the whole header is going to be bigger. So the cleanest way to do this is with a so-called pseudo element. And this looks a bit complicated, but don't worry. So what we can do is we can say nav link, and then you have before and after in CSS. Maybe you've seen that before. So when you do this, you always have to specify the content property. So here with content, the idea is that you can sort of insert content from CSS. So you can sort of create like an HTML element from the CSS. So when we do this, let's see. Yeah, so here in our project here, you now can see that we have this FDA here after their text, right? So we can sort of create an HTML element, or we can insert text from the CSS. Now we don't want to do that. We're just going to leave this empty, and we're just going to style this like a blue bar, right? So whenever you want to create sort of like a bar or like a line in CSS, typically you want to do that with a pseudo element because it won't take up any space, and you can also animate it. So here we can say the height of that blue bar should be 2 pixels. The width should be 100% of the nav link. And the color, you need to use background color here, should be a blue color. It's going to be RGB 0183255. Let's see what we get if we do that. We don't see anything yet because these are inline level elements by default, so you cannot set their height. So we're going to make it block level elements, and then we already see these blue bars, right? Now, we don't want them to take up any space. So we're going to use position absolute here to take them out of the normal flow. It's a little bit advanced. You don't have to completely understand this. But when you use position absolute and save here, they're not going to take up any space. Now, the problem with this is that they're going to be sized now. They're going to sit in relation to some other element. So we're going to have to say position relative on this element here. Right, so whenever you use position absolute, you also want to use position relative on the element that should be the reference point. Because now what we can do is we can say it should sit 0 pixels from the left, but the left of what exactly? Well, this is the reference point now, so it should sit 0 pixels of this nav link. And then we could say 0 pixels from the bottom, but that's not low enough, right? So it should actually sit a little bit lower even, so we can use a negative number. And then this is what we have. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to animate this, right? So in the example, initially it should be 0 opacity, and only when we hover this nav link should it become visible, right? So that should be a transition again. So this element should also get the transition property, and we're going to set it to 0.2 seconds in this case. All right, and initially the opacity should be 0, right? It should not be visible right now. It should be opacity 0. And only when we hover the nav link should it become visible. So let's do that now. So when we hover the nav link, so nav link in the hover state, then we want to select the after pseudo element, right? So it's getting pretty complex here. But this is how it works. So then in the hover state, the opacity should become 1. Okay, so then let's try it out. If we hover the nav link, we get a cool blue underline. Well, it looks very professional. And this is how these pseudo elements work. Now, sometimes you get a very weird issue here. If you hover down slowly here, you can sort of hover the pseudo element, which is part of the nav link, and therefore it becomes visible. And then when you hover slightly over it again, it gets removed again. So to solve this, we can say we can use pointer events none on this after pseudo element so that you don't get that weird issue. This sort of it means it's gonna ignore it when you hover it, which is what we want, right? Let's also create this button properly now. So it's gonna be this pill-shaped button with text uppercase, and well, that's basically it. So let's see, we already selected that here. So it's gonna be background color. 0071 E3. Okay, then we get that. So let's add some padding, 7 pixels on top and bottom and 18 pixels on right and left side. Okay. To make it a pill shaped, you can simply use a very large border radius, like 1000 pixels. Okay, and then we also want to make it uppercase, right? You don't have to write out these property names completely, right? So you can see I'm typing text and then I can just write another T and it will suggest text transform. I can just press tab and then it should be uppercase. So I only have to write a U and I have pressed tab and it's uppercase, right? Now it's pretty big in terms of font size. So I'm going to write font S. It will suggest font size. I'm going to press tab here. And then it's just going to be 12 pixels, right? Because it's uppercase. So typically it looks a little bit better if you make it smaller font size. And here we also want to increase the font weight a little bit because it looks a bit thin. So I can write font W, will suggest font weight, and we'll make it 500 here. Now, when you go over this with your mouse, it should become this cursor, but it should also become a bit of a darker or maybe lighter. Let's see what we did here. Yeah, it should become a little bit lighter actually. The background color should become a bit lighter. So the button in the hover state, and I'm just gonna, let's just copy this background color. And the exact color is not really important. It should just become a little bit lighter. So usually what I do is I go over here with my mouse and I just pick, some lighter color here. Now, if you want the exact same as me, it's going to be RGB 28, 128, 228. And of course, that shouldn't happen instantly. It should be a smooth transition. So here we're going to add transition again. Any property that gets changed for this button should happen in 0.2 seconds, right? You could also say background color here, but typically you want to do it for all properties because we could also change the color perhaps to black, right? And then this will also work because it's all properties, not only the background color, right? So that would also be smooth, right? So now when I hover this, you can see a nice smooth effect. All right, so this is already looking great. But we're not finished here because, well, it's looking great on wide devices. And as we make it smaller, it keeps looking great. But on very small devices, like mobile, for example, you can see it's going to crash at some point, right? This is not going to look good. So now we need to make it responsive for mobile and actually tablet as well. All right, now to make a project responsive, usually the best thing to do is to simply right click, go into inspect here. And what you can do here in the developer tools is you can change the viewport width again, right? But you can also see, it's a bit small here. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit for you. You can see the viewport width here, right? So you can see at what point it starts to become a problem, right? So you can see here, everything looks good, right? So there's no need to change anything here, but at some point you can see somewhere around here perhaps would be the best breakpoint as it's called, right? So let's pick 650. You don't have to, get a round number, but why not? Let's make it a round number. It could be 651, doesn't really matter. But at this point, let's make it, appropriate for smaller devices as well to prevent that clashing that will eventually happen. So here we're going to use media queries. So at the bottom of our style sheet here, we can have media queries. Right? And here we can say add media. And then when the viewport is at most 650 pixels, we want to have slightly different styles, right? So we're going to say the max width here is 650 pixels. In that case, we're going to select this header content element and let's see what we want to do. Let's actually look at the example here to see what we want to do. So I'm going to inspect here. Yeah, so you can see here in the example, what should happen, let's actually see. I added some comments here, you can ignore that. You can see that this header content with the logo and the nav in there should not be horizontally next to each other. They should be vertical, right? And that's actually very easy to do with Flexbox. This is one of the reasons why you should use Flexbox because it also helps a lot with responsiveness. So initially the flex direction, the default is row, right? That's why when you say display flex, those items will sit horizontally next to each other, but you can also make it column. And so then when you hit 650, they will sit like a vertical flow. Now we do want to change the padding here because now it's sitting right against the edge. So here we're going to change the padding, and actually let me make it smaller here so you can see what I'm doing. Yeah, so padding, I can change that into 25 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right side. So then we get this. So now there should be some space between the nav and the logo. So you can also have a row gap. All right, so you can just say 18 pixels. All right, so I think that looks really good. Now, you may think that the space between these items is a little bit too much, right? So we have these items, they are child elements of this nav list. And we've given that a column gap in the past. So we can say nav list column gap. Previously it was 40 pixels. Now let's say it should be 20 pixels. So they're sitting a little bit closer to each other. You can play around with that, but now it will work and look great all the way until the smallest size that you typically want to support, which is about 320 pixels, right? So these days, typically this is about the smallest size that you want to support. Now we are getting new types of devices like foldable phones that have a really narrow viewport. So you may want to change, you know, for very small devices, you want to go even further than this. But this is typically what professional developers support all the way until 320 pixels viewport width. And I think it looks great, right? So then, you know, all the way until 650, you get this wider viewport type of look. And then it becomes a stacked layout for mobile. And you don't even need a hamburger menu, right? You don't need a hamburger menu for every nav bar. This looks great. And now let's also make it fixed, right? So this is one thing that we haven't done so far. So when we scroll down, it should scroll with us. That's the last thing that we're going to do here. So it's quite straightforward, but there is, you know, there are some issues with this sometimes. So when you go to the header, this header should scroll with us when we scroll down, right? So you can say position fixed. That's what we're going to do actually, but this is not all. So when you do this, you're going to see that this header right now does not have the complete width anymore, right? So we do need to say width should be 100%. Now also the problem with a fixed nav bar is if you have content here, for example, with position fixed, just like position absolute, you're going to take it out of the normal flow, meaning other elements are going to act as if it doesn't exist. So if you have content below there, which you usually have, it's going to shift upward. And the way to solve that is usually to simply set a padding on the top of the body of the same height as the header, right? So we set the minimum height to 60 pixels. So let's also add 60 pixels to the top of the body, which will make everything, you know, shift 60 pixels to the bottom. But now we can simply set the header to be sitting at 0 pixels from the top of the viewport. And when you do that, it will scroll with us. And if you have any content below there, it will not sit, it wouldn't have shifted upwards because we have that padding sitting, moving it down again. Right, so that's one, you know, trap that you can run into when you use position fixed. All right, but now we have a very nice, simple, responsive, fixed nav bar with HTML and CSS, and you don't even need a hamburger menu. Now, if you do want to get that hamburger menu, definitely check out the version of this nav bar with the hamburger menu. I will link to that in the description. And also maybe you want to have like a double navigation bar with, for example, a phone number and like an email address or something like that on top of this header, right? So you get like a double navigation bar. I will also have a video on that. I will also link to that in the description, so definitely check it out. In any case, you know, if you want to work as a front-end developer, maybe you're already working as a front-end developer, it's really important that you have mastered CSS, especially Flexbox, but also CSS grid, animations, and transitions. There's a lot to it. I have a course on that. It takes a couple of hours, but it will benefit you for the rest of your career. So definitely check it out if you want to take your CSS to a professional or advanced level.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.